Thabisa stood trembling before the towering pillars of the royal court, her feet bare against the polished stone floor. Her dress was threadbare, patched too many times to count, and her eyes held a fear too old for her young face. All around her, murmurs curled through the chamber like smoke, accusing whispers, cruel laughter, the clucking of disapproving tongues. Before her, shattered on a silver cloth, lay the pieces of the sacred jar. The jar had always been more than just clay and paint. It had rested for generations in the Hall of Ancestors, its curved body painted with scenes of harvests, births, and battles, a record of the kingdom's soul. The elders claimed it held whispers of the dead, that it blessed the royal family with dreams from those who came before. Now it lay broken, and the blame had fallen like a stone on Thabisa's shoulders. She had only come to deliver sweet maize. It was her daily errand, a job granted out of pity by a kind steward who once knew her mother. She would walk from the workers' quarters into the palace kitchens, leave the sack by the fire and quietly retreat. She spoke little, not because she was rude but because she had learned that silence kept her safe. Her voice was soft, and in a world that shouted, soft voices were often ignored. But that morning she had taken a different route, asked by a maid to carry herbs through the western wing, a wing she had never entered before. She obeyed, steps cautious, hands steady. That's when she heard the crash. She had not yet rounded the final corner when the sound tore through the air, a sharp, echoing shatter that silenced even the wind. Thabisa had run toward it instinctively. She found the jar already fallen, its pieces scattered like bones. And the guards had found her there, frozen, eyes wide, herbs still clutched in her hand. Now she stood accused. "I did not touch it," she had whispered when first questioned. "It fell before I reached the room." But no one cared. No one believed her. She was there. "That is enough," muttered one elder. "Why else would a servant girl be wandering where only royals tread?" snapped another. A trial was held, but it was more performance than justice. Witnesses were vague, evidence non-existent. Still, her fate had already been decided by the shape of her clothes, the emptiness of her lineage and the darkness of her skin. Her mother had once been a storyteller in the court, beloved for her tales and songs, but that had been long ago. Since her passing, no one remembered the stories. They only remembered that Thabisa was alone. The queen did not attend the trial, nor did the princes or the sages of the high mountain. Only a court full of nobles who saw Thabisa as a problem to be erased. They decreed she would undergo public shaming, a brutal tradition reserved for those who dishonored the ancestors. She would be stripped to the waist and made to walk through the court at midday, under the heat of both sun and scorn. It was meant to break her. It was meant to make her disappear. As the guards led her from the hall, she did not cry. She did not beg. Her small face was lifted, not in defiance but in quiet resignation. What more could they take from someone who had already lost everything? But word travels in strange ways and truth does not always sleep. That night, an old steward named Jaji sat restless in his bed. He had known Thabisa's mother, had once danced to her songs and wept at her stories. He remembered the little girl playing beside the palace fountains, making up tales of her own. His bones ached with the knowledge of injustice. He rose before dawn and went to the Hall of Ancestors. There, among the still smoldering incense, he looked closer at the jar's remains. One shard held a strange imprint, a half-circle at its edge. Jaji knelt, placed the shard on the ground, and fetched a brass walking staff kept beside the throne for ceremonies. When he pressed its curved end to the shard, the match was perfect. A ceremonial staff, not the hands of a child, had struck the jar. The truth struck him like thunder. He remembered that the youngest prince, playing with that same staff just the day before, had been scolded by his tutor for being careless. A prince had broken the jar. A servant girl had taken the fall. Jaji, loyal but just, could not remain silent. By morning, he stood before the queen herself, who had finally returned from her retreat. With trembling hands he laid out the shard, the staff and the story. The queen was silent a long time. Her face, usually serene, darkened like a gathering storm. Without delay, she called for the guards and halted the punishment that was about to unfold in the public square. Thabisa was already in the square, surrounded by jeering crowds, her upper dress removed, her thin arms wrapped around herself. She stood motionless, enduring. She did not expect rescue. But before the horn could blow, the queen's voice rang out. "Cover her," she ordered. The crowd parted like sea before stone. The guards obeyed, placing a royal shawl around the girl's shoulders. The queen stepped forward and for the first time, looked into Thabisa's eyes. "This child is not your shame," she declared. "She is your mirror." Silence fell. Those who judged her did not see her. They saw a shadow of their own fear. But silence, like still water, reveals much when disturbed. The queen turned to the crowd. It was not she who broke the jar. And yet she stood ready to bear your cruelty. The beast's knees buckled. The queen caught her. For the first time, someone had believed her. The square buzzed with anticipation, like bees gathering before a storm. Nobles arrived first, robed in silks and suspicion, taking their seats on elevated platforms as if their height absolved them of cruelty. The commoners followed, some out of curiosity, others out of fear. Whispers passed from mouth to mouth like invisible arrows. The jar girl, they called her. The one who defied the ancestors. Every corner of the royal city seemed to pulse with the same question. Would she break in shame or speak in guilt? The Bisa stood at the center, flanked by 2 guards, her arms trembling but her eyes dry. Her clothes, tattered and thin, barely shielded her from the wind, let alone the gaze of hundreds. A wooden platform had been raised the night before, not for justice but for humiliation. The queen's advisors perched like vultures beside the queen's empty seat, eager to see the sentence executed with all its intended spectacle. A royal scribe read the charges aloud, his voice sharp as a blade. The Bisa, orphan of unknown lineage, stands accused of breaking the sacred jar of Amidlozi, vessel of ancestral breath, keeper of the queen's divine right. No confession. No witnesses. No remorse. He paused for effect. Today she will be unwrapped, not in blood but in shame, until truth spills forth. Gasps, murmurs and judgments swirled like dust. Still, no one asked how a girl so small could reach the altar where the jar had stood. No one questioned why she was alone when the temple guards were supposed to watch every corner of the palace. Guilt, it seemed, needed no proof, only a face to wear it. A bell tolled. A sign to begin. The guards approached. One untied the sash at her waist, the other tugged at her sleeves. Her body stiffened. The Bisa closed her eyes. Not out of fear but to remember. The rhythm of her mother's lullabies. The scent of the herbs her grandmother used to rub on her chest. The sound of her own breath when she lay alone beneath the stars. She held on to these not as shields but as seeds, knowing one day they would bloom into something stronger than pain. As her garment slid from her shoulders, the crowd hushed. What was expected was shame. What they found was stillness. Her skin, marked by childhood bruises and healing scars, bore the truth of survival, not guilt. Her spine stood straight. Her chin did not falter. She said nothing. The queen had not yet arrived. But from her chamber window above she watched, not as a monarch, but as a mother who once had a daughter silenced by lies. She saw the girl's stillness and something in her heart tightened. Below, one advisor whispered, "She must be made to speak. Shame is not enough." Another sneered, "Then make her kneel." But the Bisa did not bend. Children in the crowd tugged at their mother's sleeves. "Why is she not crying?" they asked. One old woman whispered, "Because those who've suffered deeper wounds learn silence as armor." The guards circled her again. A priest stepped forward with ash and water, symbols of cleansing and confession. He reached to smear her forehead, but the girl moved back just once, just slightly. Not in refusal but in refusal to be erased. That motion, so small, rippled louder than screams. It struck something in a few hearts below the platform. A young guard blinked. A cook shifted uncomfortably. A noble woman clenched her fan, as if remembering a day when silence had been her only defense too. The court scribe cleared his throat. "Confess now, child," he called. "And the queen may show mercy." Still she said nothing. The nobles grew impatient. The commoners grew uncomfortable. One woman near the front suddenly spoke, her voice thin but clear. "I saw her near the temple," she said. "But she was cleaning." The guards had told her to. Gasps followed. The advisors hissed. "Lies. Silence her." But then a guard spoke. "I remember her sweeping near the altar steps. She never touched the jar." Then another voice. And another. The crowd, once a wall of quiet judgment, began to shift. Not in full rebellion but in memory. In the sudden ache of seeing themselves in the girl who had not begged, who had not cried, who had simply stood. Suddenly a horn blew. The queen had arrived. She walked through the crowd in silence, the hem of her robe trailing behind her like a river of dusk. She climbed the platform without a word and stood beside Thabisa. She looked at the girl. Then at the crowd. Her voice when it came was cold fire. "Who among you stood for her?" she asked. "Who among you questioned why she, of all people, would harm what even my guards protect?" No one answered. I see more guilt in your silence, the queen said, than in her stillness. Then she did something no one expected. She removed her own outer robe, embroidered in gold and heavy with royal symbols, and wrapped it around the girl's shoulders. The court gasped. She may be voiceless, the queen said, but today she has undressed your guilt. And with that she turned, holding Thabisa's hand, and led her off the stage, not as a prisoner, but as someone who had reminded a kingdom what it had forgotten, that dignity is not something given by power. It is born in the soul, and it does not flinch even when stripped. The guards stepped forward, armored and grim, their hands rough and decisive. The court crier's voice rang out, naming her crime again, louder this time, as if repetition could seal truth where none existed. The sacred jar, a vessel of ancestral whispers, had been shattered. Thabisa, orphan girl with no lineage and no title, was declared the cause. She did not cry when the rough hands tore at her clothing. Each shred that fell was a piece of her dignity, and yet she refused to flinch. As the last fabric dropped, a gasp shivered through the crowd, not just at her nakedness but at her stillness. Thabisa stood upright in the heart of the court square. Her skin caught the harsh sun. Her arms did not move to shield her chest or hide her belly. Her face was still, her eyes wide and fixed beyond the heads of the watchers, as though seeing something they could not. The nobles waited for her to wail. They waited for her to collapse in shame. They waited for the begging, the tears, the apology that would make her punishment feel righteous. But Thabisa did none of it. A silence began to pool at the edges of the court. The children who had first laughed now looked up at their mothers and asked, "Why is she not afraid?" Some women turned their faces away. A few men lowered their heads. Even the kitchen boy who dropped a pot that morning suddenly felt as though a weight sat on his chest. A whisper moved through the crowd. "Why isn't she covering herself?" Thabisa's silence became louder than any scream. The queen's advisors, who stood behind their velvet-roped seats, looked at one another. They had imagined her broken by now. One advisor leaned toward the next and murmured, "Perhaps we underestimated her." But the punishment was not meant to be paused. "Confess, girl," shouted one of the guards. She said nothing. "Admit your guilt before the ancestors strike you down," called another. She blinked, slow and solemn, her lips tightly shut. Her ribs rose and fell in even rhythm. Her body, so exposed, carried a strange dignity. It was not defiance. It was deeper, an old, grounded truth, a refusal to carry their lie. In the crowd, a grandmother with cloudy eyes began to weep. "This child did nothing," she whispered. Her daughter hissed, "Shh, you'll be heard." But others had started to feel the unease. The silence was contagious. Some spectators began to step back. A few covered their own bodies as though the shame they wanted to place on Thabisa was now theirs. One of the queen's younger cousins stood up abruptly, red-faced and sweating. "This is wrong," she said too loudly. Heads turned. But she backed down when her elder brother gave her a warning glance. The queen sat on her high throne, unmoving. Her face unreadable. Her hand rested on her cane, knuckles white. She too was watching the girl, not the nakedness, not the supposed guilt, but the quiet resistance. Guards shifted their feet. One coughed nervously. Thabisa didn't tremble. She didn't kneel. She simply stood. The breeze lifted her curls. The sunlight wrapped her skin in warmth. And her eyes never left the place just above the crowd, as if her ancestors were there watching too, not from the jar but from the truth. Minutes passed like hours. The punishment was meant to crush her. But the silence crushed the spectators instead. One nobleman muttered, "What if she's innocent?" A woman responded, "Then we are the ones who are naked." And just like that, Thabisa's silence, steady, raw, and whole, undressed the court's illusion. They had stripped her of fabric, but in doing so, stripped themselves of righteousness. Still she stood. Still she did not speak. And the weight of her silence spoke louder than any cry ever could. The wind swept through the square with a force that seemed to carry more than air. It rattled banners, lifted cloaks, and caused dust to swirl in frantic circles around Thabisa's bare feet. But it wasn't just the wind's strength that froze the crowd, it was its voice. For it did not howl like the usual dry winds of the season. This wind wailed, hummed, whispered, and echoed like something ancient remembering its name. A mother held her child tighter as the infant burst into a wail. Birds that had roosted on the palace towers rose in sudden flight, circling above the square. The elders, who had lived through wars and famines, began to murmur prayers under their breath. One old woman gripped her walking stick and whispered, "The spirits are awake." Thabisa remained in the center, unmoved. Her hair lifted gently, her limbs firm despite the cold touch of the wind. Her silence had become the loudest thing in the square. No plea escaped her lips, no attempt to shield her exposed body. She stood as if clothed in something only she could feel, an armor of dignity forged not in privilege but in truth. And then it happened. A low groan came from the west side of the crowd. One of the Queen's councilmen, known for his booming voice and cruel judgments, staggered backward. His eyes rolled upward and he collapsed onto his knees. People around him rushed to help, but he waved them off, pointing at Thabisa. "The jar?" he whispered. "It wasn't her." The crowd gasped. Eyes flicked to the Queen's platform, where she sat frozen, lips parted, clearly unprepared for what was unfolding. The winds grew louder. Whispers filled the air, some seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. "She is not the breaker. The spirits have seen. Truth stands unclothed." An elder man bent with age fell to the ground, clutching his chest. People screamed, but he raised a hand weakly. "Let the girl speak, or let the wind speak for her." His voice sounded distant, almost like it echoed from beneath the earth. Still, Thabisa said nothing. Her eyes were closed now, her lips tight. But from the edges of the crowd, people began to step back, not from her but from themselves. It was as if her silence had become a mirror, forcing each person to see who they were when they watched a child be humiliated for a crime she may not have committed. One of the guards who had stripped her now looked down at his hands, trembling. Another turned his head away in shame. The Queen's advisor, who had first suggested the punishment, tried to speak but found his throat dry. He coughed, then said with cracked breath, "This is not justice." Thunder rolled, though there were no clouds. The palace bell rang without being touched. The wind now carried the sound of ululations, faint, mournful cries of the old tongue, spoken only in sacred rituals. Elders looked to the sky in reverence, knowing the spirits were not just stirring, they were judging. Thabisa opened her eyes, and something in them silenced the square again. They glowed, not with magic but with the unbearable weight of truth carried too long, of dignity denied and reclaimed. Her gaze swept over the platform, past the nobles, past the guards, and landed on a young servant girl standing in the crowd's shadow. That girl dropped her gaze instantly and took a trembling step forward. "It was me," she whispered, barely audible. No one moved. The girl's voice rose. "I broke the jar. I was cleaning too fast. I was scared they'd punish me. So I ran. I saw Thabisa in the hall and I said nothing." Silence again. But not the shaming silence of before. This one was holy. The kind that falls when truth walks into a room. The Queen rose. Her robes flared behind her like wings. She stepped down from her platform, walked slowly through the crowd and stopped before Thabisa. For the first time the Queen seemed small, not because she was weak but because the moment demanded humility from even the highest seat. She reached out and took off her own royal cloak. Gently she wrapped it around Thabisa's shoulders. The wind calmed, and the sky, which had begun to grow dim, brightened again. But still Thabisa did not speak. She simply bowed her head, not in shame but in silent triumph. She had undressed them all without uttering a single word. The heavy doors of the palace creaked open. No one had heard them in months. Not since the Queen had fallen ill and vanished from the public eye, leaving her advisors to rule in her stead. People turned, expecting perhaps another announcement, another decree read aloud by a trembling herald. But this time there was no herald. There was no announcement. Only footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate. The Queen was walking. She wore no crown. Her robes were plain, gray as morning fog, her hair wrapped in a scarf that signaled mourning. Her body looked frilier than before, but her eyes burned with something that made even the guards lower their heads. She descended the palace steps slowly, leaning on her cane, every movement echoing louder than the wind itself. People stepped back, murmuring in awe and fear. The square, which moments before had been a furnace of spectacle, now felt cold. Thabisa still stood in the center, her body bare, her posture proud, her silence heavy. But when the Queen's eyes found her, something shifted. Not in Thabisa, but in everyone else. The Queen stopped before her, a breath's distance away. She did not speak at first. She simply looked at the girl, her skin marked by the sun, her feet bloodied from the stones, her silence ringing like bells in a temple. And then she spoke. "Who did this?" No one answered. The Queen's voice had not roared. It hadn't needed to. It had struck harder than a whip. "Who?" she asked again, her tone quieter, sadder. "Did this to her?" The nobles stiffened. The advisors dared not meet her gaze. One of them, Chisano, the Queen's brother, began to shuffle his feet. His brow was beaded with sweat, his fingers twitching as if itching to disappear. But still no words came from anyone. Only the rustle of the wind. Thabisa did not speak either. She did not lower her eyes. She did not bow. Her silence did not feel like defiance. It felt like truth. It held more weight than any spoken word could. It was a mirror, and everyone looking into it saw their own faces distorted by guilt. The queen turned to the guards. "Cover her." They hesitated, looking to the advisors. "I said cover her," the queen repeated, sharper now. The guards, unsure and ashamed, moved quickly. A cloak, dark and soft, was fetched from the queen's own back and placed around Thabisa's shoulders. Still the girl did not move. She looked at the queen with the same stillness she had offered the sky and the stones. There was no gratitude in her eyes, nor hatred. Only knowing. "Why was she brought here?" the queen asked again, louder this time. One advisor cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, the sacred jar. It was broken. She was seen nearby." She was accused, the queen interrupted. The advisor paused. "Yes, Majesty." "Who accused her?" Silence. The queen's eyes swept over the line of men and women who called themselves her council. Her gaze rested on her brother last. He tried to smile, but the smile died before reaching his lips. "She is just a girl," the queen said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "And you tore her dignity because it was easier than asking questions." No one answered. No one dared. The queen stepped closer to Thabisa again. She looked at her as if trying to read something only the spirits could write. Then she asked, "Why did you not speak?" Thabisa looked at her. Then gently she closed her eyes. The wind blew once more, curling around them like the breath of ancestors. Her lips remained shut. The queen turned again, this time to the crowd. "You came to see punishment," she said, "but what you've witnessed is shame, our own." People lowered their heads. Mothers wept quietly. Fathers held their sons closer. A servant in the back fell to his knees. "She spoke nothing, yet revealed everything," the queen continued. "Let her silence be remembered more than your noise." And with that the queen took Thabisa's hand. The girl flinched slightly, as if unused to being touched gently. But she did not pull away. Together they turned from the center of the square. Together they walked back toward the palace. The queen moved slower than before, leaning on Thabisa now, her illness pressing against her bones. The crowd parted like sea before a storm. When they reached the steps, the queen paused and looked back. "No one leaves the square until the truth is spoken," she said. "And until then, you will all stand where she stood." And then they disappeared inside the palace, two figures, one born of royalty, the other raised in dust, united by silence that exposed more than any scream ever could. The first drop fell with a soft tap against the stone, unnoticed by most, save for the girl who had not spoken a word. Thabisa stood, unmoving, as the heavens finally opened above the square. The rain fell in thin curtains, steady, unrelenting, as if the sky itself could no longer bear the weight of the silence. The queen did not move either, her royal cloak quickly soaking through, the embroidery darkening with water. She stood before Thabisa, the girl her court had condemned, and said nothing more. Her earlier question still echoed in the air. Who did this? There was a stillness, not of peace but of reckoning. Then from among the gathered crowd a voice, tremulous, unsure, rose up. "I saw someone," the maid whispered. She was a palace girl, young, barely older than Thabisa, with shaking hands and eyes rimmed red. "I saw Lord Daka in the chamber. The jar wasn't broken then. But he was angry. He kicked it." Her voice caught as if she had swallowed something sharp. "He kicked it and it cracked. I said nothing. I was afraid." All heads turned toward the queen's brother, Lord Daka, who had brought forth the charge against Thabisa in the first place. He stepped back, his face a mask of mock offense. "This is slander," he spat. "A servant girl's word against mine?" But the silence had already shifted. It was no longer loyal to power. It no longer bowed before titles. "I was there," another voice said, this one from a guard at the queen's gate. He stepped forward, removing his helmet with a heavy hand. "He paid me. Said I was to say the girl had broken the jar. He gave me gold. I needed it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, louder this time. The rain intensified, drumming against heads and shoulders, soaking into skin as if it meant to wash everyone clean, or bare. The queen's hand twitched at her side. But still she said nothing. A noble woman in a pale dress collapsed to her knees, hands trembling as she wept. "I told the court it was her. I said I saw her near the chamber. I lied. I didn't want to cross Lord Dhaka. People gasped, not because of her confession, but because of the crumbling of illusion. Power had always held the truth hostage until now. Another elder spoke, then a younger steward. Words fell like the rain, broken, repentant, wet with shame. The square was no longer a place of judgment, but a place of unraveling. And Thabisa? Still she stood. Naked, yes, but no longer stripped. She was being clothed, slowly, word by word, in truth. Children huddled against their mothers, some crying, some staring with wide eyes. One boy offered his cloak to cover her, but she did not take it. It was not warmth she needed, it was justice. The queen finally turned her gaze from Thabisa to the crowd. I was sick, she said quietly, her voice no louder than a breath. But not blind. I have known my brother's cruelty. I have known how silence is used like a blade. And still I let it grow. She looked at her court, now reduced to shivering, guilty souls. Shame, she continued, is not in nakedness. It is in falsehood. In cowardice. In power used to crush the voiceless. She removed her own royal necklace and stepped forward. Gently she placed it in Thabisa's hand, the first thing the girl had been given in days, other than stares. I name you not criminal but witness. Not guilty but guardian. Thunder rumbled far above. No lightning followed, only the rain which softened now as if the skies had cried their fill. The queen turned to her brother, her eyes sharp with something ancient and royal. You are stripped, she said. Not by sword or punishment, but by truth. And it is truth that will try you. Guard stepped forward, this time not at Thabisa's side, but behind Lord Dhaka. He did not resist. He only looked around, blinking like a man who had never seen the sky, who now found it too wide and too real. And then quietly he began to weep. Thabisa, still silent, felt the weight lift from her chest. She had not spoken once. Yet she had said everything. Rainwater swirled at her feet, carrying away the dirt, the fear, the echoes of shame. The ground beneath her glistened. As people began to kneel, nobles, guards, servants, it was not to her body they bowed but to her strength. Her silence had become a language no lie could stand against. The queen reached for Thabisa's hand. Come, she said softly. Let us leave this place as women who have nothing to hide. And together they walked through the court of shame, the square that had condemned, then confessed, into the rain, into the future, leaving behind only the sound of falling truth. The queen's voice, once feared and distant, now echoed gently through the square as she stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Thabisa's. Slowly, deliberately, she unclasped the heavy golden robe from her shoulders, the symbol of royalty, justice, and law, and walked across the stone path toward the girl who had stood in silence longer than any soul could bear. The robe shimmered in the fading daylight, rich with embroidery, weighty with history. When she reached Thabisa, the queen did not hesitate. With reverent care, she draped the robe around the girl's naked body, her hands steady, her face solemn. The cloth fell over Thabisa's shoulders, covering not just skin but wounds unseen, the bruises of humiliation, abandonment, and silence. She is not guilty, the queen said, her voice low yet thunderous, cutting through the stillness like a blade through silk. But many of you are. Her gaze swept across the square, to the nobles, the judges, the guards who had dragged Thabisa forward, the crowd who had watched without protest. Shame rolled over them like a second wind. Thabisa's shoulders trembled as her silence broke, not with screams or anger but with quiet sobs. Her tears fell freely, streaking down her face, carving through the dust of injustice. She cried not because she was weak, not because she had broken, but because for the first time, someone had seen her. Someone had given her back the dignity they tried to strip away. The queen surprised everyone again. Slowly, she sank to her knees before Thabisa, her hands resting on the hem of the robe now wrapped around the girl. A hush fell again, deeper and more reverent than before. A queen kneeling before a girl? It was not custom. It was not law. It was justice. And in that moment, a whisper passed through the people, not from the wind, not from the ancestors, but from their own hearts. We did this. We allowed this. Never again. Justice had not been shouted. It had been worn. And in Thabisa's silence they had heard the loudest truth. The elder stepped forward, her voice soft but carrying the weight of years and storms. In her wrinkled hands she held a shard from the jar, not from the moment it shattered but from long before. The surface was worn, the lines faint but clear to a trained eye. She turned the piece slowly in her fingers and looked up at the silent court. This jar, she began, was cracked long before Thabisa ever touched it. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eyes darted toward one another, But the elder didn't waver. She walked to the center where the remains of the broken vessel still lay, and knelt beside them. It was made with haste, under pressure to impress the queen's brother, she continued. The potter warned of its flaws, but no one listened. You wanted beauty more than strength. And when it broke, you blamed the girl who simply passed it along. Her eyes found the queen, then the judges, then the people, one by one. You blamed her, she said, to hide your own cracks. The silence grew heavier. Not awkward, not uncertain, but honest, stripped of its pride. The elder's words had reached where no law had. Thabisa stood nearby, still cloaked in the queen's robe. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence now felt like thunder in their ears. And it was endurance, clarity, and truth, the kind that made even the powerful feel exposed. Someone in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Another lowered their eyes. The elder gently placed the shard down beside the others. We built a world that breaks the innocent so we don't have to fix ourselves, she said. But it's time we stop pretending the cracks aren't there. Thabisa met the elder's eyes. No words passed between them, yet a thread of recognition pulled taut. For years, her silence had been misunderstood, as guilt, as defiance, as nothingness. But now they saw it for what it truly was, the quiet strength to carry truth when no one else dared speak it. The jar had always been broken. It just took Thabisa's stillness for the world to finally notice. The square was still as stone when the old woman stepped forward. Her feet, bare and dry, brushed over the dust like whispers of time. She wore no crown, no jewels, no title, only a shawl of fading reds and deep earth browns, woven with the kind of thread that carried generations. Her eyes, clouded with age but sharp with truth, settled not on Thabisa, not on the queen, but on the jar. It lay at the center of the courtyard, its pieces scattered like bones, glinting in the low sun. No one had dared move them. Even after the queen had wrapped Thabisa in her royal robe. Even after the guards stepped away in silence. Even after the murmurs began to rise, questioning, unsure, afraid. The elder reached down and picked up the largest shard. A long crack ran through it, jagged and aged. She turned it in her hands and nodded to herself. Then she looked to the crowd and said, "You think it broke yesterday?" No one answered. You think her hands made it fall. You think her silence was guilt. Her voice was thin but unshakable, like the last branch of a tree that still held against the wind. But this jar, she held it high, was already cracked. Long ago. Its breaking was inevitable. A breath moved through the crowd. Uncomfortable. Unsettling. But undeniable. I was there, the elder said. Not yesterday. Years ago. When the jar first arrived. When the queen's father was still alive. He ordered it be placed in the hall, a gift from the north, they said, filled with wisdom and warnings. She turned her gaze toward the queen now, who stood robeless beside Thabisa. The queen did not flinch. But it arrived damaged, the elder continued. They covered the cracks with gold paint. They said to leave it untouched, just for display. A symbol, they said. But it was a lie. A jar with no use, made beautiful only to hide its weakness. There were murmurs now, the beginning of discomfort turned to unrest. You all knew it, she said, looking slowly around. You walked past it every day. Saw the paint flaking. Saw the lines growing. You knew. But it was easier to pretend it was whole. Easier to accuse a girl than admit that you let something broken stand for so long. The silence was a weight. You blamed her to hide your own cracks. That line hit the court like thunder. A man near the steps, one of the ministers, looked away. A woman who had once demanded Thabisa's punishment clutched her own wrist, as if something inside her had started to ache. Even the guards began to shift in place, no longer statues of order, but men with memories. You demanded noise to drown out the truth, the elder said. But Thabisa's silence, that silence held more power than all your shouting. The elder walked toward Thabisa then. The queen stepped aside, and the girl stood still as the woman reached up and brushed a curl of hair from her face. You knew, didn't you? The elder asked softly. You saw the cracks. Thabisa blinked, then nodded once. You stayed silent not because you were afraid, but because you didn't want to lie like them. Thabisa's lips parted, but still no words came. Only her eyes answered. That was enough. The elder turned again to the crowd. This is not the story of a broken jar. It is the story of broken people. And the child who bore their shame. A deep hush followed her words. Then, not loud but unmistakable, the sound of someone weeping. A councilwoman. The same one who had first called for Thabisa's public punishment. She had declared, with fire in her voice, that no mercy be shown to the girl. And now she wept like a child before an elder's truth. She was a servant, the elder said, and yet she carried your guilt. She was a girl and yet she endured your silence. She was innocent and yet you taught her shame. The queen took a breath. What must we do? The elder's gaze fell on the queen again. You must listen, she said. Truly listen. Not to defend yourself. Not to prepare an answer. But to hear. The queen nodded, but the elder's eyes were not done. They turned back to the people. All of you. Listen to the silence you tried to bury. Let it ring in your bones. She stepped away then, letting the broken shard fall gently onto the pile at the center of the square. The sound it made, a soft clink against the stone, was louder than the court had ever heard. Then Thabisa moved. Not away, not toward the queen, but forward. Toward the broken pieces. She stepped around them, careful not to touch but not afraid to look. She stared down at the jar as if seeing not ruin, but a mirror. Behind her, the queen took the elder's words to heart. She ordered the royal tailors to mend Thabisa's clothes with the same gold thread that once adorned her robe. She appointed the girl not to serve but to speak, at councils, at ceremonies, at trials. To be a voice when others fell into shouting or silence. But Thabisa did not become loud. She did not rise in anger. She simply stood, like a tree that once bent under storm and now reached upward with grace. Her silence remained, but now it was respected. It was no longer mistaken for guilt. It was known for what it had always been, strength. Years later, children would gather in the courtyard, where the pieces of the jar were now kept in a glass case. Not glued back. Not hidden. But laid out visible. A symbol, not of shame but of reckoning. And the children would ask, who broke the jar? And their elders would reply, we all did. But then they would point to the robe now displayed beside the shards, once worn by a queen, later wrapped around a servant girl, and they would say, and she taught us how to mend. Because justice had never been in the jar. It had been in the silence that made them listen. And in the truth that never needed to shout. The square, still wet from the cleansing rain, held its breath as the queen stepped closer to Thabisa. Every pair of eyes that once judged her now watched with awe and trembling. The queen, draped in heavy robes of gold and red, symbols of her rule, paused. Her fingers, though ringed with power, trembled slightly as she reached for the clasp at her throat. The metal unlatched with a small click, but it echoed like a hammer against stone in the hushed court. Then, slowly, deliberately, she slipped the robe from her shoulders. Beneath it, she wore only the simple linen of mourning, a fabric unseen on her since the death of her mother many years ago. But now it seemed right. Power stripped, sorrow worn. As the robe left her, the crowd saw the queen not as sovereign but as woman. Human. She stepped toward Thabisa, the robe folded carefully in her arms like sacred cloth. No guard moved to stop her. No advisor dared whisper. When she reached the girl, she did not throw the robe over her as one might a beggar. No, she knelt. Her knees touched the wet stone of the square, staining the hem of her linen. And with reverent hands she lifted the heavy robe and wrapped it around Thabisa's shivering body. The fabric clung to Thabisa's skin, warm still from the queen's own body. It smelled of spices, of power, of a throne, but also of tears. Thabisa's back, marked red by shame and exposure, was now draped in the richest cloth in the kingdom. The robe dwarfed her frame, but it held her like an embrace. The queen did not rise immediately. Her hands remained on the girl's shoulders, steady. And then she said, voice ringing clear over the wet hush, "This girl is not guilty." Gasps rippled. A noblewoman clutched her chest. A man in a fine feathered hat dropped his staff. Somewhere a child whimpered. The queen's eyes swept over the crowd. But many of you are. The robe was not just fabric now. Was a mirror. As it lay on Thabisa's body, the nobles saw themselves, their cruelty, their silence, their convenience. In draping her with it, the queen had transferred not just warmth but truth. Thabisa, who had not shed a tear through stripping, through stoning glares, through wind and silence and accusation, finally wept. They were not the tears of brokenness. Not shame. Not surrender. They were the tears of someone finally seen, wholly, clearly, and without condition. Her face crumpled not because she was ruined, but because for the first time since her ordeal began, someone reached across the fire to say, "You matter." The queen remained kneeling, her arms still around her. "Forgive us," she said, not to the gods but to Thabisa. In the corners of the square, a few servants fell to their knees too. A guard lowered his spear and dropped it, hands trembling. The queen's brother, his fine coat now clinging in the rain, tried to look away but found he couldn't. His lips opened then closed. His lies crumbled like parchment in water. The court that once demanded Thabisa stand naked for their judgment, now stood exposed themselves, not in body but in soul. Their dignity felt thin compared to hers. Their truth, watered down by politics and fear, looked pitiful beside her silence. "Your robe belongs to you," Thabisa whispered finally, voice soft, but it shook the square. The queen looked up at her, her eyes rimmed with red. "Not anymore. It belongs to the one who carried more dignity in nakedness than we did in crowns." Silence again. But this one was different. It did not accuse. It listened. Then an elder, her voice raspy, stepped forward. "Let the robe stay where it has found its honor." And so it was. The queen did not take it back. The robe that had once trailed the marble floors of the palace, that had brushed against ministers and kings, now bore the weight of one girl, and it did not collapse. Someone brought the Bisa sandals. Someone else bread. Not out of pity but reverence. A mother in the crowd lifted her child high and said, "Look. Look at the woman wrapped in truth." And the child stared with wide eyes not at the queen but at the Bisa. The nobles who once controlled fates could no longer command attention. Their titles did not shield them from the storm now rising, not of wind but of reckoning. Eyes once used to looking down on others now dropped with shame. The queen's advisors fidgeted, their scrolls damp and useless. "We must correct the records," one said weakly. "No," said the queen. "We must correct ourselves." In the days that followed, the robe remained with the Bisa. She did not return it. Nor was she asked. It was said she walked the palace gardens with it, sometimes sitting under the same fig tree where judgment had once been passed. Children began to follow her, mimicking her silent strength. Women whispered her name with reverence. Men bowed without being told. No title was given to her. She didn't need one. She was not queen, but she was something perhaps more sacred, living truth. The queen ruled, yes. But the Bisa reigned, not from a throne but from hearts. The robe faded over time, the red dulling, the gold thread fraying. But it was never mended. For its worn state became its pride. Each thread spoke, "Justice can be costly. But it is never wasted." Sometimes visitors would arrive from far-off lands, hearing of a girl once stripped, once shamed. They'd expect a legend with fire and swords. Instead, they found a woman tending herbs, quiet and warm, with a torn royal robe draped across her shoulders. They'd ask, "Were you the girl?" And she'd smile gently. Sometimes she'd say yes. Other times she'd say nothing. Because silence had always been her greatest power. And in that silence, the robe of justice still spoke.